This episode of the Big5D podcast is brought to you by Realm Digital. Realm empowers industry leaders through innovative business solutions. Please visit them at realmdigital.com. That's REALM digital.com. Hello, welcome to the Big5D podcast. I'm Charles Laughlin, Content Director for Big5 Digital, joined by Nic Rawhani. Nick, did I pronounce that right?
You absolutely did. You killed it, Charles. I'm very happy.
Okay, great. Welcome to the podcast. You're the CEO and co-founder of Vula. Is that right?
That is indeed right. Vula. It's a Xhosa word, and it means open.
I was going to ask that. Thank you for sparing me a question. Okay, so we're going to get into Vula, but we really want to talk about today is why Vula is on this exists. And the reason, and you can correct me at any point, is that, well, you're an AI-driven company, but you're addressing a very specific problem, but it's a very large problem, which is the SME funding gap in Africa. I don't know if you also address other emerging markets.
We're focused on Africa for now. It's a big enough issue. Okay. It's small, but it's big enough.
Yeah. If you've flown from the top of it to the bottom of it,
exactly.
It's not small. Any rate, so before we get into what that problem is, which is, I think, worth a bit of discussion, tell us just quickly where you come from, what your technical background is, what your entrepreneurial background is, that sort of thing.
Sure, for sure. So I'm South African, born and raised. My parents are originally from Iran, and through a very long story, landed up together in South Africa in the mid-'80s at the height of apartheid. I was born in 1994, so just after the end of apartheid, and grew up there, background in software engineering, with a focus on electrical and power engineering as well. And at the same time as I was doing that, I was doing a lot of community development across townships in Johannesburg, really working on youth empowerment. And I think these two elements, kind of my technical background and then my community development background, really informed what I'm doing here at Vula. After that, I went to Imperial in London and then to McKinsey, where, among other things, I focused on African finance.
Oh, you're another McKinsey guy. Okay.
Yeah. You know, we pop up everywhere where there's something exciting happening. You can find us.
Okay. How long were you at McKinsey?
I was at McKinsey for 2 years.
That sounds like a normal tenure. It seems like you do a couple years at McKinsey, then you go start a company or something like that.
You know, a lot of people.
How did that happen with you?
A lot of people think that McKinsey is like a company where, like a normal company. McKinsey is anything but a normal company.
I believe that.
The best way to think about it is that it's an organization of about 40,000 really talented freelancers who know really well what they do. And they come together for projects under a particular philosophy of how teams work together and break apart. And they just keep doing this. And so if you're an entrepreneur or entrepreneurial-minded person, it's a really good place to go to basically practice a lot of fundamental entrepreneurial skills, like being able to pitch yourself, being able to pitch your ideas, putting together teams, hiring people, firing people, thinking about the way that you can bring value in a very short amount of time. Yeah, these are all incredible skills that I gained while I was at the firm.
And you can learn about an industry very quickly, right? You can
100%. And not just learn about an industry, but also learn from the people who are making the decisions in that industry directly, what that looks like. So I'm very grateful for my time at McKinsey. It was a lot of fun. But yeah, basically after 2 years, I was like itching to go. I was like, cool, I feel like I'm capable. Let's get going with this company.
And so we went from McKinsey to Vula?
Yeah,
exactly. Or was there something in between? Okay.
No, and also just to say, toward the end of my time at McKinsey, I was actually between London and Lagos and working specifically on this issue, on the problem of SMEs and startups getting access to financing in Africa.
Oh, okay. So start there. When were you exposed to this issue, problem, whatever we want to call it? How did you learn about it? And then at what point was there a light bulb that said, I am going to build a company that solves this?
So as a South African, you see this as part of your economic and social reality all the time, right? Johannesburg is the richest square mile in Africa. It is filled with the continent's hustlers, right? It's filled with super successful business people and people who have come from rural areas coming to make their fortune, and everybody in between. And when you're growing up in that type of an environment, basically everybody around you is an entrepreneur. Even if they have a stable corporate job, on the side, they've got something going, And so growing up, I was surrounded by entrepreneurs. Everybody in my family is an entrepreneur. All of my friends are entrepreneurs. And this is everything from like the creative industry, where, for instance, I worked as a photographer and creative director for about 4 years while I was going through university, to like really big business. And I saw the issue like immediately growing up that, you know, there's this huge pool of talent. But the type of exposure or opportunities that talented people from where I'm from get is very different from the pool of opportunities that talented people from where you're from get. And the question was, how do we kind of bridge that gap? And that was a big part of my work with young people in townships as well, was what do you do after school? What are the opportunities that are open for you? And most importantly, how do you see yourself as a protagonist of your and your own community's development? Yeah. And so I was doing a lot of work on this during my time during my undergrad. And then I actually, in 2017, 2018 was when Google opened a big office in Johannesburg. And everybody in my class was like, yes, like this is it. We've timed it to perfection. But it gave me the opportunity to really reflect and say like, well, what are the problems that I really want to solve? And a big part of that was like, how do I create way more paths to prosperity for people in my country and for people, you know, across the rest of the continent? And so I moved to a rural area called Eqhawe in the Eastern Cape of South Africa and ran a youth empowerment project there for about 1.5 years. That got me noticed by the Department of Higher Education of South Africa as it gained some momentum and got me a scholarship to Imperial. While I was at Imperial, I was doing a lot of thinking and writing on the concept of sustainable development and infrastructure development across Africa. And it kind of raised two really interesting phenomena that I think were the light bulb moments for me. One is called demographic dividends. And this is basically the idea that any time in history, a population gets to a stage of development where infant mortality drops. And so, you know, families or women might be having 5 or 6 children on average. And then there's one generation where all 5 or 6 of them don't die. So you have these huge families all of a sudden and everybody lives. And so you have this boom of babies. That's where in the US you get the baby boomers. In Europe, it happened after World War II. And in Africa, it's happening right now. You know this story, you know, the youngest continent in the world, median age of 19. And you know, over the next 10 years, we're going to be adding more young people to the global workforce than the rest of the world combined. So on the one hand, I was thinking about that and the fact that right now we're woefully under-tooled for being able to take on those young people. You know, like the African Development Bank released this report, I think 2020, that basically said that there's about 12 million skilled young people being added to the workforce in Africa and only about 3 million formal jobs being added. So you can see how huge that
word there is formal, right? So
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so these are skilled, these are graduates of, you know, these are graduates of universities getting skilled degrees. These are people coming out with real skills to contribute. Never mind even the informal economy, which is way bigger.
Right. But
and so, oh, sorry, please.
The point there is, I guess, I don't know if this is jumping ahead, but if there's no formal jobs for them, don't they sort of have to invent their own career?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And so you see kind of where a lot of the hustle in an African context comes from, right? Like no one's going to be making a plan for you, so you better make a plan. Right. But the reality, statistically speaking, is that we also have some of the largest youth unemployment rates in the world. So as much as we do have this culture of making things work, things also aren't working. Right. And so I was thinking a lot about the fact that over the next 10 years, this problem is only going to compound as our population grows. And what is a huge economic opportunity, I mean, we've seen China and what they've done with their demographic dividends raise 400 million people out of poverty, really could turn into a crisis for us. So on the one hand, I was thinking about this. I was also writing about a problem called capital flight, which is, in short, the problem that in Africa, our governments have to take on debt for our development to spend on large development programs, but we don't have local firms that are scaled enough to actually do the work of our development. And so our governments take on debt and then have to spend it back overseas where they took the debt from.
They hire companies outside of, yeah.
They hire a company from outside. You don't have a local team, you don't have a local presence, etc. And this was a huge problem that I was aware of. And the answer there is like you need to have more and more locally based companies with local expertise so that you you as an African country are not a passive observer of your own process of development. You're an active protagonist. And so it was while I was thinking about all of this that I got the offer from McKinsey, and I was super excited about that, because here is like a perfect platform to learn about these issues, speak to the thought leaders, speak to the change makers, actually learn about almost the practicalities of what it means to deploy huge amounts of cash or to run these types of programs. And so I feel very, very privileged at the work that I was able to do there, and the perspectives that I was able to gain. And it was during that time as well that I got to work with a huge number of African SMEs, like straight up. And we're not talking about people who are selling fruit on the side of the road.
How that happened? How did you, as a McKinsey consultant or whatever, actually work with SMEs in, I guess it was in Nigeria? Or,
well, there's a huge amount of work that the firm does, both from its public sector side as well as really on its impact side in trying to create much better and healthier business ecosystems around the world. And basically, as somebody who is very passionate about these spaces and who's built skills in them, you can very quickly differentiate yourself and basically get onto those teams and start to contribute. And so I was lucky enough to be able to get onto one of those teams and start contributing. And what that really meant was systematically examining this ecosystem for what are those blockers that are preventing SMEs from accessing financing, from scaling, etc.
Yeah, and what were your observations about sort of what was getting in the way? I mean, we'll get into the banking part, which was, I think, a big part of this. But other than that?
Well, I think you have to look at the history of African finance to understand why it even, why does African finance exist and what were the kind of founding principles? And the reality is, like, finance in Africa was set up to finance international conglomerates who are entering Africa during colonization in the colonial period, basically for the extraction of resources at scale. And so extractives, oil and gas, these types of companies were doing really well because their job was to basically extract raw materials and take it somewhere else for processing and value addition. And that's why across Africa, some of the best corporate bankers, some of the best M&A people are African finance professionals, because at the corporate scale, we can run with the best of them. And our banking infrastructure has been set up for that. And then post-colonization, 70s, 80s, and coming into the modern age with mobile banking, there's also been a huge amount of emphasis on enabling end users, right? Consumer banking, transactional banking. And this is where most African traditional financial institutions make their money, right? And so all of this to say, we haven't had a history of traditional sources of SME funding playing a significant role or gaining their skills in the African landscape.
So the mining companies have had no problem accessing capital. But
if you want to start a mining company right now, I know like 5 guys I can introduce you to. You know what I mean? Yeah, we'll talk after the podcast. But like, if you want to start and scale like a multi-chain bakery,
right,
or you want to create a construction company, it's a lot more difficult.
And on that point, one thing I noticed in your talk at our conference in March was that you weren't talking about, spezzer shops. You were talking about established SMEs, like you
100%.
described there.
Yes.
They were the ones, everyone, but they're among the ones most notably having difficulty accessing capital to open that new location or add 5 employees
100%.
or whatever it is.
Exactly. And basically since the early 2000s, the role of microfinance institutions has definitely grown on the continent. And they've been doing some incredible work, especially those who are focused on those kind of smaller check sizes. But there is very much this missing middle. And McKinsey has this incredible report on the missing middle in Africa. It's particularly focused on South Africa, but it definitely extends to the reality across the continent, because you can kind of think of South Africa's financing ecosystem as kind of 10 to 15 years ahead of everyone else, just because of historical reasons, especially when it comes to kind of financing. And so, with Vula, really, we're thinking about what we estimate to be about 2 million formally registered enterprises across the continent. And these are not the kind of informal fruit sellers or people like
because that number gets into the tens of millions, right?
So I can just give you some numbers on this. The IFC did a really good report in 2018. They estimated there are about 44 million informal enterprises across the continent, and then anywhere from about 700,000 to 5 million formal enterprises across the continent.
Okay.
And those numbers are from a range of
your
sources.
working number is 2 million.
Our working number is 2 million. And this is the crazy thing.
Is that your addressable market, essentially?
Well, that's our addressable market of users.
Okay. I understand. That's not who's paying you. We'll get to that.
Yeah, that's not who's paying us. Those aren't our customers. But that is who we serve as users.
Yeah. Okay. So addressable market may not be the right term, but that is.
Absolutely. That's who we're focused on. That's who we're focused on. And but just to say as well, Charles, and this comes back to the complexity of the history of African finance, is that, like I said, we're hustlers. So we don't allow these barriers to just stop us. Instead, we make alternative plans. And so you can see an entire alternative financing ecosystem when it comes to African financing that is kind of this very complex and twisted web of relationships between development finance institutions, public government development finance institutions, private credit institutions overseas and on the continent, sometimes venture capital and private equity, angel investors, and a range of other alternative crowdfunding, credit unions, credit groups. There's a bunch of things that we've done to kind of work around this. But that level of complexity also means that there's friction in the market. And that friction is what Vula is trying to reduce and to create way more visibility around, because it's crazy that we can't even give an accurate answer within one order of magnitude of how many formal enterprises there are on the continent.
You would think the fact that they're formal would mean that they're identifiable and that you could measure this, but
you'd think.
You tell me.
But data silos are a real thing. And so even the ability of African governments and their innovation and small business enterprise departments to be able to actually collect that data and use it and communicate it, it's a super tough issue that a lot of these.
You would think you just look at those who have like a VAT number or something like that,
You'd wish that it was like that, but it's not, unfortunately, not yet.
Okay, fair enough. I accepted. So you have identified the funding gap at $330 billion. I don't know if you identified.
It's actually probably closer to 400 billion. Okay. So 330 billion is the number.
How that number came about and what's behind that number?
100%. So this again goes back to the World Bank, who did a 2018 study. It's probably one of the most impressive studies we've seen in this space. They invested a lot of time and effort into it. But basically what they did was that they looked at all developing countries in the world, what they classified as middle to lower income countries. And they did surveys. They did surveys of their local kind of small enterprise development agencies. They did surveys of their informal sectors as well. They took data from where they could, et cetera, and compiled it basically from a grassroots level where they could, and built up this picture of the number of SMEs that even operate, MSMEs that operate in these countries, how many of them have access, partial access, or no access to their financing ecosystem, what the reasons behind that were. I really encourage anybody who's thinking about this space to start and ground themselves at that report. And at that time, 2018, the total amount for Africa of the funding gap, that is funding that is in demand, legitimate demand from SMEs on the continent, was $330 billion. We've seen reports since then, because that's more than 5 years ago now, that have taken the number all the way up to $410, $450 billion. Of course, we can imagine some of the issues that came with COVID and the huge number of SMEs that died there. But since subsequent to that, there's been a huge amount more that have grown back up.
COVID may have killed a lot of businesses, but also led to a lot of business formation, right?
Exactly.
It churned things. It turned things over.
It was a churn. It was definitely a churning situation. The other thing to mention, though, is that, out of those 2 million formal enterprises that we're referring to, there's a significant chunk of them who are actually on lenders to, who are microfinance institutions or on lenders to some of the informal sector players as well. And they're a really vital part of this ecosystem, right? You can think about it like the vein, the arteries, the veins, and then you get all the way down to like the tiny capillaries. Exactly. And so you need the entire system, but again, COVID hit a lot of those businesses quite hard as well, right? You're sitting on a balance sheet, you're getting some issues, and now we're starting to see a resurgence of those MFIs who are back in business.
So let's pivot to what you do and how you address
Yes,
this, because we at least
absolutely.
identified the size of the problem and some of the reasons for it. So you're not a lender, you're not a bank, you're none of
No,
those things, but you partner
no, we're
with
not interested in
lending
it.
institutions, right? Talk
Exactly.
First, talk about why you decided this is where we're going to build and we're going to address this part of the problem. Talk about that a little, and then talk about who you partner with and how you affect making it easier for SMEs to get money.
Absolutely. So I spoke about those two big problems that I was doing a lot of thinking around,
Mm-hmm.
right? The problem of demographic dividends and the problem of capital flight. And we realized early on that SMEs and enabling SMEs are the answer to both of these. Whereas startups, for instance, the whole value proposition of a startup is we can create more revenue with less people, with less labor base. An SME scales it scales the organization with the labor base. And so SMEs and growing and scaling SMEs both answer the issue of how do we create infrastructure to absorb these skilled young Africans. And it also answers the question of how do we get more local firms who can be active participants in our own development. And so very early on, we knew that we wanted to be an enabler for this ecosystem. The question was like, well, how do we do it? So my co-founder Alex Goff, he's incredible. His mind will not be stopped. And one of the really important, vital experiences he had in the past is he was building AI systems for some of the biggest banks in the UK. And what his systems were recommender systems. So basically, when you call the call center of a major UK bank, their call center agent is speaking to you, but he or she has an AI assistant that's basically taken all of the data points about you as a customer and digested that and then used that to suggest 3 out of 4,000 potential products that you would be best matched to. Mm-hmm. And I think the fundamental insight that we had at Vula was because these large language model systems are becoming more and more, much cheaper to operate and much more accessible, why don't we put these at the service of African SMEs? In the same way as you can take thousands of data points about an individual, you can get thousands of data points about a business and then introduce it to immediately, automatically find its best funding options, not just in debt, but actually across the capital stack. Because where a business is at also should be reflected in the type of funding it accesses. So that means grants, that means impact capital, it means debt capital, and potentially even equity a bit down the line.
One thing I've noticed that Alex shares a lot of links on social, LinkedIn, of, here's a place where you can go apply for a grant. So you're curating a lot of that 100%. Information.
We're curating a lot of it, and we've built, and this is the tech part that excites me is we've built really this super cool infrastructure that is sort of almost running itself at this stage of taking and curating these new opportunities and putting them in front of the most relevant entrepreneurs on our platform. So it's also this important part that as a founder, as an SME founder, even if you're super experienced and you've got a huge successful business, you've still got this huge burden on you to go out to the funding landscape, to find your best funding option, to then find the best way to pitch yourself, to go through reams and reams of applications and then kind of hold thumbs while you're almost being rejected. And that history of real unsuccessful and bad user experience has led to this gap, which is that a lot of SMEs don't even engage
is
in the
part
funding.
Of the problem that they were so frustrated and so exasperated by the whole thing that they just don't even apply for lending.
100%. I'm not gonna name names right now and shame names, but some of our major banks on the continent, if you as an SME even want to apply for funding, you're still expected to print out a PDF from their website and fill it in by hand and then scan it and send it back to them. And then they take 2 to 4 weeks to get back to you, and it's probably a no. So you can imagine why would SMEs continue to engage with this when I'm trying to run a business? And so for Vula, from the point of view of the SMEs, what we're really trying to do is to encourage way better usage of the time of entrepreneurs. Because 90% of the data you use to apply is the same, whether you're applying for a grant or debt or impact capital. It's like, give me that data and documents. And now Vula's AI assistant can go out and find it for you, and soon will apply for you.
So what you're doing essentially is using AI to take to compress the application process. Is that a fair way to describe it?
I think that compressing the application process is one part of the value proposition. The other part is putting your best foot forward very easily. Because Vula understands what it is this grant maker or this debt funder is looking for. So it takes your
data and gives the best story based on that data to the lender or grant maker or whatever it is.
That's exactly right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what I am curious about is what's in it for the banks. And my sense is that more opportunity to make money off of loans to more businesses that are properly qualified through this new process. Is that a fair description? Talk about that.
100%. I think that's very much it. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, that our users are SMEs, but we've designed Vula so that it's free for SMEs, that there isn't
They're not going to be the ones who pay
you. Because African SMEs don't have money, man. This is the whole point that we're trying to solve. Like now you're going to try and charge them, and you'd be surprised how many middlemen do that. I imagine
you could take a cut, but that would be that'd be sort of against your mission, right?
So instead, what we do is that we, our real customers and our users who we love and care about are the financial institutions. And I'm talking about SME funders across the board. So I don't want you only to think about banks. It is big banks, but it's also non-bank financiers, specialist lenders, grant makers, development financiers, private foundations, basically anybody.
Is there an entity you choose not to work with?
There are loads of entities we choose not to work with, but that's because they're not ready.
You know what I'm saying?
No. And basically because what we want is to massively simplify the process for African entrepreneurs. We want there to be one place that they can come to and know that based on their eligibility criteria, they've been checked against everything from a crowdfunding platform in the middle of Iceland to an impact investor in the middle of Latin America to the big bank that's right down the road. And everybody in between, because a lot of the time you have a huge premium that African enterprises are generating that they're not aware of. That's called impact, right? The fact that I'm a female-owned clothing manufacturer in the middle of Rwanda who just treats her business as a business, and as I'm not aware that the Icelandic government would give me $100,000 at the drop of a hat and would bow at my feet for being able to do that, is lost on me.
As long as you help them tell the story of the impact that they've created.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And the story is important. So part of what Vula is trying to bridge is like, let the entrepreneur be aware of all of those opportunities and help them find the best one. And so on the side of the funder, what we're really doing is not just helping them to originate great stories and great deals that they wouldn't otherwise know about, but that is there. But it's also to be able to optimize their own internal systems. Because another thing that we discovered as we got to kind of peek behind the sausage factory is really how old school a lot of SME supporters, whether they're grant makers or lenders, are and how they operate. And, there are elements of that business that need to stay that way. For instance, the relationships between the funder and the SME is super important. But there are elements which definitely shouldn't be trapped in the early 2000s, right? There are elements of automating onboarding, taking on data, understanding, cross-departmental learnings, which really should be brought into 2024. And the cool thing about what's happening with AI and how Vula is building out that infrastructure is that we enable all of these learnings, which a lot of funders have already generated. They just don't know about them because they're sitting in some sort of a Word document somewhere deep inside your SharePoint, to be brought to the fore and to be used as part of daily operations.
Just to be clear, tell me what the pitch is to these financial institutions to work with Vula.
For sure. Basically, it's three things. Vula provides you with the tools to increase the volume of inbound applications, increase the quality of those applications, and massively improve the efficiency of your internal operations. All with the goal of enabling any African funder, Africa-focused funder, to 10x their internal capabilities to serve the system.
Are they receptive? I mean, what makes their eyes light up? Which part of that makes their eyes light up?
I mean, all three of those. If I'm not getting kind of eyes lighting up over and over again, but it also depends on the funders. So, we see some huge funders who get thousands of applications for funding a year, who spend an inordinate amount of money or time, and usually some combination of both, literally just going through applications, right? Like you can think about the fact that when you're trying to examine a company's balance sheet, let's say, or their income statement and decide, is this company healthy enough for me? As a funder, you're risking the upfront time to have to do that. You've got a team of 20 people and they take an hour to do that.
You're less likely to devote that time if you're not sure that it's going to be, or there's going to be a return on that time.
Exactly right.
You can reduce that time
or you create
look at more opportunities.
Yeah. You create a high-end threshold. You say, okay, cool, I'm not going to look at deals below $1 million because it's not worth my time to even consider it. But if that process takes 4 seconds, because our AI is doing it instead, you can devote your time to much more of the market.
Total sense. So are they looking at this from, we can make more loans, we can reduce staff? I mean, what KPIs are you moving?
So
let's talk about banks. What KPIs are you moving?
So it's basically the number of So it's the number of successfully deployed loans, or rather lowering the number of non-performing loans, but also the amount of time and money per decision. So the cost per decision, and this cost to serve metric is really that.
Do they all know what KPI. That cost to serve is? I mean, is that a number that's
nobody knows their exact. Nobody knows their exact cost to serve. There are some fundamental basic tools that you can introduce to the operations of a bank or a large lender, which can fundamentally change the way that they operate and just give them strategic vision over, like, what is the flow of SMEs through our application process? Like, how many are actually making it through? What's the stories of those that we're rejecting? Why? To be able to do that at aggregation, like at an aggregated level, is still not within the capability sets of most banks. And you can tell that if you've ever been an SME needing to apply, because of how bad the experience is.
Okay. So you're improving the experience for SMEs, you're improving their opportunity to get lending. From the lender's standpoint, you're making it easier for them to make profitable loans to SMEs.
Exactly. Yes. And reducing the cost for them to even consider loans.
Right?
Yeah.
So
100%.
Talk about, and AI is behind all this. What are the limitations of AI right now to do what you want to do? And how do you see that evolving? I mean, that's part of a bigger question about where AI is heading, but specifically applied to what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. So like Vula, I think is a great example of a company that's applying AI models for huge impact and social good. We're not developing our own foundational models, right? We're using all the big names. All the big names that you know of, we're using their technology. Right. We're built on top of it. And we decided that from the beginning, basically because that enables us with our back end plumbing to just plug in whatever is the best spot at that time to run that. We do, we're an API first company. So we're plugging in the right bot behind our engine. And what's cool is that over the past year, the capabilities that have been built up by these San Francisco-based, Silicon Valley-based companies has massively accelerated. And so we get to really, so far, really enjoy the wave of what that means for the quality of what Vula is putting out, of its analysis. Because we're also doing a lot of analysis for the funder, right? They've got thousands of SMEs that they're considering, and they want to see trends. They want to cross-compare. They want to internal benchmark. We can do all of that now. And so we've seen a huge acceleration in the quality of what these AI agents can do on both sides of this equation. And it's only getting better. I think the limitations at the moment are really in two spaces. One has to do with like complex mathematics. So when we're doing, for instance, financial analysis behind the scenes, it's a lot more complex in terms of the software that we have to build. We basically get the AI to extract the right numbers from from thousands of different combinations and templates of balance sheets, pull that out, run analysis on that, which is much more traditional software, and then spit that back out to the AI who uses that for analysis. Because right now, large language models are just not strong at complex math.
That's not what common saying. They don't do math that well, which seems odd, but math is not their, like me, that was never my strong subject.
Yeah, it's not their strong point. It's not. I think the best way to think about it is what seems to be happening is that these AI models have an internal monologue like you and I have. And they can be tricked in very similar ways as humans can be tricked. When you were in primary school, you had these really smart riddles that would like trick you to think a step further. LLMs, especially early LLMs, got tricked by the exact same riddles in the same way.
Well, I mean, it's like at the conference, you did mention hallucinations, and I did want to ask about that because
Yes.
Some people make too much of it, some people make too little of it, but I've heard it described that hallucinations are going away. I've heard it described that they will never go away. I'm not sure which is true.
Yeah, we've seen
I've heard
massive
that. I've heard that.
reductions in hallucinations, and I think that there's another element to this, which is also the latest kind of technological upgrade that we've made at Vula has to do with what's called retrieval augmented generation. And this is basically combining the power of search, like the power of Google, with the power of large language models, so that you have this brain that's really smart and kind of performs like a university graduate. But then at the same time, you have this superhuman ability to search within thousands of documents to pull out the right information. And the combination of those two things so far in our system has led to a lot less hallucinations.
Hallucinations have always been described to me sort of in human terms. It's like when you don't know the answer to the question, you make something up.
You make it up. Exactly. You make it up. And the cool trick is, I mean, it's a little bit, I'm simplifying it a bit more, but if you give the AI the chance to you create the environment to say, hey, it's cool to say, I don't know, don't feel pressured. It's much better.
I don't know.
You can create a much better environment.
Any day of the week.
Yeah. Exactly. Over the wrong answer.
Nic, I'm afraid we're going to have to wind this down, but I do have one last question for you. It's more as a founder than as related to the topic we've been discussing, and it is AI related. And I'm always fascinated. I've been almost obsessed with this Sam Altman comment fairly recently. It was on a conversation he had with the founder of Reddit's name is now escaping me, but they had this conversation where they were talking about the $1 billion unicorn. Or I'm sorry, the single person unicorn, $1 billion unicorn. That is,
the single founder.
That is what a unicorn is.
Absolutely.
And it's using AI tools to scale a business with very few people. And I've since asked a lot of founders about this, and I get a very skeptical answer. Oh yeah, you can do a lot with AI, but no one's going to write $1 billion check for a one-person company, and that really wasn't the point of that. But at any rate, I'm wondering how you think about scaling a business in the AI era around that sort of theme of.
I think what's interesting about this question in our context is like we're trying to build one of the fundamental building blocks of enabling that to happen, basically, which isn't just that you're going to have AI in your company working for you, but you're also going to be in an environment of other AI agents that can do work for you within other business contexts. And in our case, what we're trying to build, our vision for the future, is that there isn't a concept of a business going out for funding anymore. Instead, the right funding comes to you at the point at which you need it, because you've got this AI assistant, it's monitoring what your business operations are, and it comes to you and says, hey, you've just qualified for these 5 people, and you can one-click apply and see if you get the money or not. But then that's it. And I can imagine that happening a lot more across other elements of business. Like, for instance, a good friend of mine, Hassan Sukar, has a company called 11X, and they do AI prospecting. So now finding customers who are actually interested in what you have to offer is also something which doesn't require a team of 20 people anymore. And so if you've got the funding and you've got the customers, and soon you'll be able to identify the suppliers, then we're really reducing the barrier of what it means to participate and create value as a human. And, it might sound like kind of Star Trek-y, but that's 100% the exact process we're trying to create. I think the additional exciting part for us at Vula is that we believe that's going to start in Africa, because even though it's where it's most desperately needed and where the rest of the world sees is behind, we see it as another opportunity to kind of leapfrog, to show this is what's possible. What's possible is that the funding can come to you. The marketplace can come to you, and only those most relevant elements of it can.
So you think the days of chasing, desperately white knuckle chasing early stage funding are coming to a close? Or
I think you have 10 years to still play that game. I think what it is that early stage investors, whether they're doing debt or grants or venture capital, what they're going to be doing on a daily basis in 10 years' time is going to be completely different. And even the system is going to be different. The idea that we have rounds that are so well defined, I really see a future where we're going to be streaming money, where money is going to be streaming like a YouTube video streams, and the money is going to go to wherever it's most
found based on the data, etc.
Millisecond. And it will be found based on Vula.
Good place to end it, Nic. So last thing, tell people where they can get a hold of you, either through socials or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so on socials, I'm on Nic Rawhani, NICRAWHANI on Twitter or X.
You like.
You can also go to vula.vc to reach out to us, sign up, try it out. We're very easy to reach and very responsive.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, Charles. It's a pleasure to be on BigFive, man. It's an institution.
Thanks for listening to the Big5D podcast. I'm your host, Charles Laughlin. Our guest today was Nic Rawhani of Vula, and our sponsor is Realm Digital. If you're interested in participating in this podcast as a guest or as a sponsor, please reach out to us at info@big5digital.org. That's info@big5digital.org. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.